The wealthiest man in Montana Territory had just turned away his 20th bride in 6 months when the gunshot rang out. Ethan Blackwood didn't flinch. He'd grown accustomed to the sound of desperation echoing across his frozen land. What he hadn't expected was to find a woman standing at his gate the next morning, alone, asking nothing. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, she was the only one who didn't. This is the story of how a cold-hearted cowboy finally opened his door and discovered that the bride no one else wanted was the only one worth choosing. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The winter of 1882 descended upon northern Montana like a judge's gavel, swift, final, and unforgiving. Snow accumulated in drifts that swallowed fence posts whole, and the wind carried a bite that could strip the hope from even the most optimistic settler. But inside the Blackwood estate, a different kind of cold had taken residence, one that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the man who owned it. Ethan Blackwood stood at the window of his study, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, watching the latest carriage disappear down the long drive that led away from his property. The vehicle rocked and swayed through the snow, carrying yet another rejected bride back to whatever city had spawned her ambitions. He didn't bother counting anymore. Was this the 18th? The 20th? They blurred together, these women with their calculated smiles and rehearsed conversations, their eyes always drifting toward the expansive rooms, the fine furniture, the visible markers of his wealth. "Boss, that's the Hendrickson girl gone," came a voice from the doorway. Samuel, his foreman of 15 years, stood with his hat in his weathered hands, his expression somewhere between concern and exasperation. "Her father ain't gonna be pleased. That was his third daughter he sent your way." "Then perhaps Hendrickson should teach his daughters that a man is more than the size of his bank account," Ethan replied without turning from the window. His voice carried the smooth, educated tone of someone who'd spent years in Boston society before returning to claim his inheritance. But there was an edge beneath it, something sharp and deliberately maintained. Samuel shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking beneath him. "Folks in town are starting to talk, Ethan. They're saying you're impossible to please. Some are saying worse, that you're too proud for your own good, that you think yourself above everyone else." "Let them talk," Ethan said, finally turning from the window. At 34, he was a man in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was handsome in a hard-edged way, all sharp angles and firm jaw, the kind of face that belonged on wanted posters or oil paintings, depending on your perspective. Their opinions changed nothing. "Maybe not," Samuel conceded, moving further into the room. He'd known Ethan since the man was a boy, had watched him transform from an eager young heir into this fortress of a human being. But winter's only going to get harder. A man shouldn't spend it alone in a house this big. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something quickly suppressed. "I'm not alone. I have 40 ranch hands, a house staff of 12, and apparently an endless parade of matrimonial candidates. You know that ain't what I mean. Then perhaps you should say what you mean, Samuel." The older man sighed, recognizing the defensive wall going up. He'd seen it countless times before. "I mean that having people around you ain't the same as having people with you. There's a difference between a full house and a full heart, and you've only got one of those things." Ethan took a long drink from his glass, the whiskey burning down his throat. "My heart is perfectly functional, I assure you. It pumps blood efficiently enough to keep me standing here refusing your unsolicited wisdom." "There was a time you weren't like this," Samuel pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "There was a time you believed in—" "That was a long time ago," Ethan cut him off, his voice dropping to something dangerous and low. "And that time is over. I built this ranch into the most profitable operation in 3 territories. I employ more men than anyone else in the region. I've made myself into something that matters. That should be enough." "For what? For who?" Samuel asked, but Ethan had already turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. When the foreman finally left, closing the door quietly behind him, Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His reflection stared back at him from the darkening window glass. A man surrounded by luxury but drowning in silence. The Blackwood estate was indeed impressive by any measure. Ethan's grandfather had claimed the land in the 1840s, but it was Ethan who had transformed it from a modest cattle operation into an empire. The main house was a monument to success, 3 stories of imported timber and crafted stone, with enough rooms to house a small army. Crystal chandeliers hung in the dining hall, purchased during a trip to New York. The furniture came from Chicago, the silverware from San Francisco. Every inch of the place screamed wealth and taste, and every inch of it felt hollow. Ethan moved through the rooms that evening like a ghost haunting his own life. The dining table could seat 20, but he ate alone, as always, with only the soft footsteps of servants breaking the silence. His bedroom was larger than most family homes, dominated by a massive 4-poster bed that he occupied only one side of, never quite able to spread himself across the full width of the mattress. It felt like an admission of something he refused to acknowledge. He'd built all of this for a reason, though the reason had long since soured in his memory. There had been a time, 7 years ago now, though it felt like both yesterday and a lifetime, when he'd believed love was real, when he'd trusted that someone could want him for himself rather than for what he represented. Her name had been Margaret, and she'd had a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made everything feel possible. They'd met in Boston, where Ethan had gone to study business and agriculture, determined to bring modern methods back to the family ranch. Margaret was the daughter of a banker, educated and cultured, and for 2 years, Ethan had been certain he'd found something genuine in a city full of pretense. He'd proposed on a spring evening, presenting her with a ring that had cost him every penny of his saved wages. She'd said yes, tears in her eyes, and he'd felt like he could conquer the world. Then his father had died unexpectedly, and Ethan had to return to Montana to take over the struggling ranch. He'd expected Margaret to come with him, as they'd planned. Instead, she'd sat him down in her father's parlor and explained with careful kindness that she couldn't possibly leave Boston for some frontier wilderness, that she'd assumed he would eventually return to civilization, not drag her away from it. "I care for you, Ethan," she'd said, and he could still hear the pity in her voice. "But I can't live like that. I wasn't meant for hard country and uncertain futures, surely you understand." What he'd understood was that her love had conditions he couldn't meet, that when faced with choosing between him and her comfort, between partnership and security, she'd made her decision without hesitation. He'd returned to Montana alone, broken in ways he'd never fully acknowledged, and he'd channeled that pain into something productive, building the ranch into something undeniable, creating wealth that no one could question, constructing a life so successful that nobody could ever again say he wasn't enough. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd made himself into exactly the kind of man Margaret would have wanted, wealthy, powerful, established. But he'd done it by hardening himself against the very vulnerability that had allowed him to love her in the first place. Now women came to him in droves, but he saw through every one of them. The Hendrickson daughters with their practiced charm, the Morrison girl who'd spent the entire interview cataloging his possessions with her eyes, the Turner woman who'd actually asked about his life insurance policy before he'd shown her the door. They wanted the empire he'd built, the security he could provide, the status that came with the Blackwood name. Not one of them had asked him about his dreams. Not one had inquired about his fears or his hopes or the things that kept him awake at night. They looked at him and saw a solution to their problems, an answer to their prayers, a key to a better life. None of them saw him at all. "Perhaps that's for the best," he muttered to himself that night, standing on the balcony off his bedroom despite the freezing temperature. The ranch spread out before him, barns and bunkhouses, corrals and pastures, all of it his, all of it built through his own determination and will. Better to be alone than to be seen as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. Down in the bunkhouse, Samuel sat with a group of the longer-tenured ranch hands, men who'd been with the Blackwood operation long enough to remember when Ethan had been different, younger, more open, quicker to laugh. "He sent another one away?" asked Robert, the head wrangler, a man whose face looked like tanned leather and whose hands could gentle the wildest horse. Samuel nodded, packing tobacco into his pipe. "The middle Hendrickson girl. Pretty thing, well-mannered, would have made a fine wife for someone. But not for Ethan, apparently." "What's he looking for?" wondered Thomas, one of the younger hands, who'd only been with the ranch for 3 years. "Man's got everything. Money, land, respect. Seems like any woman would be lucky to have him." "That's just it," Samuel said, lighting his pipe and taking a long draw. He doesn't want someone who feels lucky to have him. He wants someone who wants him, not what he's built. Ain't that the same thing? Thomas asked, genuinely confused. Robert shook his head. No, son. One's about what you can get. The other's about who you're with. Ethan learned the difference the hard way, and now he can't unlearn it. Seems like a lonely way to live, Thomas observed. It is, Samuel agreed quietly. But I don't think he knows how to live any other way anymore. He's built himself a fortress, and now he's trapped inside it. The men sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howl of wind outside. Finally, Robert spoke again. You know what I think? I think he needs someone who doesn't need him. Someone who's got their own reasons for being, their own strength. All these society girls and ambitious daughters, they're looking for someone to complete their lives. Ethan needs someone whose life is already complete, who'd just be willing to share it with him. That's a tall order, Samuel said. Women like that don't usually end up looking for husbands. They're too busy living. Maybe, Robert allowed, but maybe that's exactly why it would work. Up in the main house, Ethan finally came in from the cold, his fingers numb and his breath fogging in the air. He moved through the darkened hallways, past empty rooms that echoed with his footsteps, and tried not to calculate how many years he might spend walking these floors alone. In his study, he poured himself another whiskey and sat in the leather chair that had been his father's, then his grandfather's, and now his. On the wall hung a portrait of his parents on their wedding day, his father stern and proud, his mother beautiful and serene. They'd had something real, he knew. His father had been a hard man, difficult and demanding, but his mother had loved him anyway, had seen past the rough exterior to something worth cherishing. Ethan wondered sometimes if that ability had died with her, if the world had simply changed into something colder and more transactional, or if the change was only in him. The whiskey burned, but it didn't warm him. Nothing seemed to warm him anymore. The next morning broke gray and bitter, the kind of day when the sun seemed to have given up trying to reach Montana. Ethan rose early, as always, dressed in the practical clothes of a working ranch owner, denim and flannel, boots broken in by years of use. He might have money for silk and fine wool, but he'd never been a man to dress above the work he did. He was in the stables, checking on a mare that had pulled up lame when Samuel found him. "Boss, there's someone at the gate." Ethan didn't look up from the mare's foreleg, which he was examining with careful attention. "Tell whoever's father sent them that the answer is no." "I don't think she's got a father sending her," Samuel said carefully. "Least not anymore. And she didn't come in a carriage." That made Ethan pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean she rode up on a horse that's seen better days, wearing clothes that are worn but clean, and she asked, very politely, if she might have a moment of your time." "Did she give a name?" "Clara Hale. Said she's been working at the Morrison place for the past 6 months, but they're closing up the house for the winter and heading back east. She's looking for work, not a wedding." Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. In all the months of door-to-door bride delivery, not one woman had come asking for employment. Work doing what? She didn't specify, just said she's capable and willing, and she'd appreciate a chance to prove it. There was something in Samuel's tone, a carefully maintained neutrality that suggested he found this worth Ethan's attention. The foreman wasn't one for games or manipulation, which meant he genuinely thought this was different. "Where is she now?" "Still at the gate. I told her to wait, that I'd see if you were receiving visitors." Ethan considered. Every instinct told him to send her away, to maintain the walls he'd built, to refuse any potential complication. But something else, curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the sheer novelty of a woman who wanted work instead of a wedding, made him nod. "I'll see her in the kitchen. Give me 10 minutes. Samuel's expression didn't change, but Ethan caught the slightest hint of approval in his eyes as the foreman headed back toward the gate. Ethan took his time walking from the stables to the main house, partly to collect himself and partly because he was genuinely uncertain what to expect. A woman seeking employment in winter, with the snows already deep and most work scarce, that spoke either of desperation or determination, and he wasn't sure which possibility unsettled him more. The kitchen was warm when he entered, heated by the massive stove where his cook, Martha, was already preparing the noon meal. She glanced up at him with raised eyebrows, but said nothing, stepping aside to give him space as Samuel led the visitor in through the back entrance. Ethan's first thought was that Clara Hale looked nothing like the parade of potential brides who'd come before her. Where they'd worn their finest traveling clothes, styled hair, and practiced expressions, this woman was plainly dressed in dark wool, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her face bare of any cosmetic enhancement. She was in her mid-20s, he guessed, with features that were more interesting than beautiful. Strong cheekbones, a firm jaw, eyes that were a clear, startling blue against her wind-reddened skin. But it was her posture that struck him most. She stood straight but not rigid, her gaze direct but not challenging, her hands folded calmly at her waist. There was a quality of stillness about her, as if she'd learned to take up exactly the space she needed, and no more. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice low and steady, "thank you for seeing me. I know I've come unannounced, and I apologize for the presumption." "Samuel says you're looking for work," Ethan replied, skipping past pleasantries. "What kind of work?" "Whatever kind you need done," Clara said simply. "I can cook, clean, mend, manage household accounts. I can handle horses, tend livestock, work a garden. I'm literate and numerate. I'm healthy and strong. I don't drink, I don't cause drama, and I don't quit when things get difficult." It was delivered without boast or false modesty, just a straightforward listing of facts. Ethan found himself studying her more closely, noting the calluses on her hands when she gestured, the practical cut of her clothes, the worn but well-maintained boots. "Where are you from originally?" "Pennsylvania. My father was a farmer. I learned young how to work." "And what brought you to Montana?" There was the slightest pause, the first break in her composure. "A husband, 3 years ago. He passed last spring." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ethan said, the phrase automatic but not insincere. Clara's expression didn't change. "Thank you, but condolences aren't necessary. It wasn't a happy marriage. His death was not a tragedy, just a fact." The bluntness of it caught Ethan off guard. Most women would have at least pretended at grief, would have played the widow card for sympathy. Instead, Clara Hale stated the truth with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to list her capabilities. "And the Morrison family were kind enough to employ me after my husband died. I managed their household, supervised their staff, but they're going back to Boston for good, and they don't need a frontier housekeeper in the city. I can provide references if you'd like." "Why here?" Ethan asked. "Why my ranch specifically?" For the first time, something like a smile touched Clara's face. Small, wry, and somehow sad. "Because you have a reputation, Mr. Blackwood. The town talks. Everyone knows you've been turning away potential brides like they're door-to-door salesmen. I figured a man who doesn't want a wife might appreciate an employee who just wants to work." It was so unexpected, so perfectly logical, that Ethan almost laughed. Almost. "You don't want to get married?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "I've been married," Clara said flatly. "Once was enough." There was a story there, Ethan knew, something harder than the simple fact of a husband's death. But before he could probe further, Clara spoke again. "I'm not here to complicate your life, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here because winter is coming in hard. I need work, and you have work that needs doing. That's all. No expectations beyond fair wages for fair labor." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in any of the other women who'd crossed his threshold. No calculation in her eyes, no assessment of his worth, no hidden agenda lurking behind polite conversation. Just straightforward honesty and a willingness to work. It should have made him immediately hire her. Instead, it made him suspicious. "No one is that simple, Miss Hale. Everyone wants something beyond wages." "Mrs. Hale," she corrected gently. "I'm widowed, not unmarried, and you're right. I do want something beyond wages. I want stability. I want a warm place to sleep and 3 meals a day. I want work that matters and pay I can save. I want to not spend another winter wondering if I'll make it to spring, but I'm willing to earn all of that, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not asking for charity or favor. I'm offering an exchange, my labor for your payment. That's all." Martha, who'd been pretending not to listen while chopping vegetables with unnecessary vigor, cleared her throat. "Boss, I could use help in this kitchen, if you're asking my opinion. And the house is too big for the 3 girls we've got cleaning it. Another set of capable hands wouldn't hurt. Ethan shot his cook a look that said he knew exactly what she was doing, but Martha just smiled serenely and went back to her chopping. He turned back to Clara, who waited patiently, not pushing or pleading, just standing in his kitchen with quiet dignity and cold reddened cheeks. "You understand that this would just be employment," Ethan said slowly. "Nothing more. I won't have anyone getting ideas or expectations beyond that." "I understand perfectly," Clara replied. "You've made your position quite clear, Mr. Blackwood. You don't want a wife. I don't want a husband. That makes us compatible as employer and employee, wouldn't you say?" There was no sarcasm in her tone, no hidden meaning, just simple logic. And maybe that's what made Ethan nod, made him say words he hadn't planned to say. "All right, 2-week trial. You'll work with Martha in the kitchen and help with the household management. Wages are standard. I'll pay you what I pay my other house staff, room and board included. If it works out, we'll discuss permanent employment. If it doesn't, you'll get 2 weeks' pay and enough to see you through to spring. Fair?" "More than fair," Clara said, and this time her smile was genuine, transforming her face into something that wasn't quite beautiful, but was undeniably compelling. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret this." "We'll see," Ethan said, but even as he spoke, he felt something shift, some tiny crack in the walls he'd built, some small letting in of light. He told himself it meant nothing, that she was just another employee, just a practical solution to practical needs, that her presence would change nothing about the carefully controlled isolation of his life. But as he watched Clara Hale settle into his kitchen, removing her worn coat and rolling up her sleeves to help Martha with the noon meal, he felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years, something that might have been hope if he'd allowed himself to name it. Instead, he pushed the feeling down, locked it away, and walked back out into the cold Montana morning to inspect his empire and remind himself that he didn't need anyone to complete what he'd built. The crack in his walls, though small, had formed. And Clara Hale, with her quiet competence and her complete lack of expectations, had made it without even trying. The first 3 days passed in a careful dance of distance and observation. Clara moved through the Blackwood house like water finding its level, quietly, efficiently, never drawing more attention than necessary. She rose before dawn to help Martha prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, her hands quick and practiced as she kneaded dough and fried eggs in quantities that would feed an army. By the time Ethan came down each morning, the kitchen was already filled with the smells of coffee and bacon, and Clara would be wiping down counters or organizing supplies, never quite meeting his eyes but always aware of his presence. He found himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The way she moved had an economy to it, no wasted motion or unnecessary flourish. When she cleaned, she didn't just dust surfaces. She understood the logic of a room, reorganizing as she went so that everything made more sense than it had before. When she mended torn shirts for the ranch hands, her stitches were small and even, the kind of work that spoke of years spent making things last, because there was no money for replacement. "She's good," Martha told him on the 3rd evening, cornering him in his study after dinner. The cook was a woman who'd been with the Blackwood family for 20 years, and she'd earned the right to speak her mind. "Better than good. She's got a head on her shoulders, and she doesn't need constant direction. Had 3 of the ranch hands bring their torn gear to her today, and she fixed everything without complaint, even reworked one of the saddlebags so it'll hold more weight." Ethan looked up from the ledgers he'd been reviewing. "And nothing. Just thought you should know you made a good choice, even if you made it for stubborn reasons." "I don't know what you mean," Martha snorted. "Sure you don't. You hired that girl because she's the first woman who's walked through your door who didn't want something from you. Don't think I haven't noticed." "I hired her because you said you needed help in the kitchen." "I said I could use help. That's different from need. But I'm glad you did, whatever your reasons. She's good for this house. Place has been too quiet for too long. Too much silence, and not enough living." After Martha left, Ethan sat in the growing darkness of his study, not bothering to light more lamps. He could hear the distant sounds of Clara and Martha cleaning up from dinner, their voices a low murmur through the walls. It was a sound he'd never quite noticed before, the sound of a house being inhabited rather than just occupied. On the 4th day, the pattern broke. Ethan was in the north pasture with Samuel and a handful of men, checking the cattle before the next storm rolled in. The sky had that heavy gray quality that promised snow, and the temperature was dropping by the hour. They'd just finished counting the herd when one of the younger hands, a kid named Billy, who couldn't have been more than 19, came riding up at a pace that immediately signaled trouble. "Boss, there's a problem at the house," Billy called out, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "One of the new mares got spooked and kicked through her stall, cut herself bad on the splintered wood. Martha sent me to fetch you." Ethan was already moving, swinging up into his saddle. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Mrs. Hale's with her now, trying to keep her calm, but the mare's thrashing and bleeding everywhere." They rode hard back to the main barn, arriving to find organized chaos. The injured mare was in the largest stall, her eyes rolling white with fear and pain. Blood streaked her shoulder and front leg where the wood had torn into her. Clara was in the stall with her, speaking in a low, continuous murmur, one hand on the horse's neck and the other holding a cloth against the worst of the bleeding. "Easy, girl," Clara was saying, her voice remarkably steady considering the dangerous position she was in. The mare was easily 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle, but Clara stood her ground, seeming to understand instinctively that showing fear would only make things worse. "Easy now. We're going to help you. Just stay still. Let us help." Ethan moved into the stall slowly, not wanting to add to the horse's agitation. "How long has she been like this?" "About 20 minutes, Claire replied without taking her eyes off the mare. "She's calming down, but she's lost a fair amount of blood. The wounds need cleaning and stitching." "I sent for Doc Hendricks, but he's out at the Paulson Ranch," Samuel said from outside the stall. "Won't be back for hours." Ethan assessed the situation quickly. The mare couldn't wait hours. She'd either bleed out or work herself into such a state that they'd lose her anyway. He looked at Clara, who was still maintaining that steady contact with the frightened animal, and made a decision. "Can you keep her calm while I work?" Clara met his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived, and he saw no fear there, only clear-eyed assessment. "Yes." "Then stay there. Talk to her. Samuel, get me hot water, clean cloths, needle and thread, the heavy kind we use for tack repair, and whiskey." For the next hour, Ethan worked while Clara held the mare's attention. He cleaned the wounds carefully, removing splinters of wood and dirt, then stitched the deeper cuts with hands that were steadier than he felt. All the while, Clara kept up that low, continuous stream of words. Not quite singing, not quite talking, just a soothing flow of sound that seemed to wrap around the frightened animal like a blanket. "You're doing fine," Clara murmured. "Such a brave girl. I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but it's going to be all right. We've got you. You're not alone." Ethan found himself half listening to her words, even as he focused on his work, and he realized she wasn't just talking to the horse. There was something in her voice, some deep understanding of fear and pain, and the comfort of not facing it alone. That spoke of her own experiences. When he finally tied off the last stitch and stepped back, his shirt was streaked with blood and sweat despite the cold. The mare was still standing, no longer thrashing, her head lowered in exhaustion. Clara's hand never left her neck. "She's going to be all right," Ethan said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You did well." "So did you," Clara replied, and there was something in her eyes, respect, maybe, or recognition, that made him look away first. Samuel appeared with fresh blankets for the mare and grain mixed with molasses to encourage her to eat. As the men secured the stall and settled the horse for the night, Ethan and Clara walked back toward the main house in silence. The snow had started falling, soft and persistent, and their breath fogged in the cold air. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" Ethan asked. "My father kept draft horses for the farm. I grew up around them, learned young that they're like people. They just want to know someone's paying attention, that they're not facing trouble alone." "Not everyone feels that way." Clara glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. "No, I suppose not. Some people prefer to face everything alone. Safer that way, maybe." "Safer," Ethan repeated, and he couldn't tell if she was making an observation or an accusation. They'd reached the back door of the house when Clara paused, her hand on the door frame. "Mr. Blackwood, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why did you really hire me? Martha's good at reading people, and she says you did it because I didn't want anything from you. But that's not quite right, is it? You hired me because you wanted to prove something." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. And what exactly do you think I wanted to prove? That you could keep someone at arm's length even when they were living in your house. That you could be around someone without risking anything. Clara's voice was gentle, but the words landed like stones. I recognize it because I'm doing the same thing. We both are. We're two people who learned that wanting things is dangerous, so we've convinced ourselves we don't want anything anymore. You don't know anything about me, Ethan said, and he heard the defensiveness in his own voice. No, I don't, and you don't know anything about me, and maybe that's exactly how we both want it. Clara opened the door, then paused again. But for what it's worth, Mr. Blackwood, you were kind to that horse today, patient and careful. Whatever walls you've built around yourself, they don't go all the way down. That's something, at least. She went inside before he could respond, leaving him standing in the falling snow with words caught in his throat and something uncomfortable churning in his gut. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself in the library, a room he rarely used despite his love of reading. He'd built this space with floor-to-ceiling shelves, imported books from across the country, installed comfortable chairs near the fireplace. It should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it felt like a museum, beautiful and untouched and utterly lifeless. He was standing at the window, watching the snow accumulate in drifts, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Couldn't sleep either? Clara's voice was quiet, slightly apologetic. She was wrapped in a simple dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he'd met her. It made her look younger, more vulnerable. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted something to read. You're not intruding. Help yourself to any book you'd like. Clara moved to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines with something like reverence. I haven't been in a library like this since I left Pennsylvania. My father had books, but nothing like this collection. Do you miss it, Pennsylvania? She was quiet for a long moment, considering. I miss who I was there. Does that make sense? I miss the girl who believed things would work out, who thought hard work and good intentions were enough. I don't miss the place itself. What changed? Clara pulled a book from the shelf, Dickens, he noted, and turned to face him. The firelight caught in her eyes, making them look less blue and more gray. I got married to a man I didn't love because my father needed the alliance. Jacob Hale had money and a homestead claim out here. My father had debts and a farm that was failing. It was a practical arrangement, everyone said. Practical. She said the word like it tasted bitter. And was it? Ethan asked, surprising himself with the question. Practical. Oh, it was very practical. Jacob got a wife who could work hard and didn't complain. My father got enough money to save his farm, and I got to learn exactly how much of yourself you can lose when you live with someone who sees you as a transaction rather than a person. The honesty of it hit Ethan like a punch. He hurt you. Not the way you're thinking. He never raised a hand to me. But there are other ways to hurt someone, Mr. Blackwood. There are slower, quieter ways. Jacob wasn't cruel exactly. He was just absent. Even when he was in the same room, he was absent. I could have been anyone, anything. I was just the woman who cooked his meals and mended his clothes and shared his bed occasionally when he remembered I was there. She paused, and Ethan saw her grip tighten on the book. He died in his sleep one night. Heart just stopped. I found him the next morning, and do you know what I felt? Not grief, not even relief, really, just nothing. And that's what scared me most. That 3 years with him had taught me to feel nothing at all, that I'd become as absent as he was. But you didn't, Ethan said quietly. I saw you today with that mare. You felt plenty. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and he felt something pass between them, some recognition of shared wounds, of parallel scars. Animals are easier than people, she said softly. They don't pretend to care when they don't. They don't make you into something useful and call it love. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan found himself speaking before he could think better of it. 7 years ago, I was engaged to a woman in Boston, Margaret Cheltenham. I thought she loved me for who I was. Turned out she loved who she thought I'd become. Someone established and sophisticated, someone who'd keep her in the life she was accustomed to. When I had to come back here to take over the ranch, she ended things. Very civilly, very kindly. She explained that she simply couldn't live this kind of life. And that's why you turn away every woman who comes here, Clara said. Not a question, but a statement. Because you're waiting for one who doesn't want the life you've built. I'm not waiting for anything, Ethan said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. Clara stepped closer, and in the firelight, her face was all angles and shadows. I think you are. I think you're waiting for someone to want you the way you needed Margaret to want you. For yourself, not for what you can provide. But here's the thing, Mr. Blackwood. That's just as much of a transaction as what she wanted. You're still asking someone to prove their love by giving up comfort, or security, or whatever else. You're just asking for a different kind of sacrifice. The observation struck too close to something Ethan had never let himself examine. That's not, isn't it? Clara interrupted, her voice still gentle but insistent. You've turned this whole thing into a test. If a woman wants your money or your status, she fails. If she doesn't want those things, then maybe she's worthy. But you've forgotten that people can want both things at once. They can want you and want security. They can love you and also appreciate the life you've built. One doesn't invalidate the other. You say that, but nothing. I married Jacob for practical reasons, and it was a mistake. Not because practical reasons are wrong, but because there was nothing else there. No affection, no respect, no genuine companionship. But if there had been, if I'd cared for him and he'd cared for me, and the practical aspects were just a bonus, that wouldn't have been wrong. That would have been smart. Ethan felt something crack inside him, some long-held belief beginning to splinter. Then why did you tell me earlier that once was enough? Why aren't you looking for that combination now? Clara's smile was sad and knowing. Because I'm just as scared as you are, Mr. Blackwood. Because it's easier to say I don't want anyone than to risk wanting someone and having it go wrong again. We're not that different, you and I. We're both hiding behind practical reasons and convincing ourselves we chose this isolation. The truth of it was devastating and liberating all at once. They stood there in the library, two people who'd been strangers a week ago, who'd built their lives around not needing anyone. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt seen. I don't know how to do anything else, he admitted, and the words felt like they'd been pulled from somewhere deep and hidden. I don't know how to want something without waiting for it to be taken away. Neither do I, Clara said simply. So maybe we just don't. Maybe we just exist here. Two people who understand what it's like to be afraid of wanting things. No expectations, no tests, no proving anything, just honesty when we can manage it and silence when we can't. It should have felt like a defeat, this mutual agreement to stay broken. Instead, it felt like relief. I can do that, Ethan said. Good. Clara clutched her book and moved toward the door, then paused. Thank you for not treating me like I'm fragile because of what I told you. Jacob used to do that, act like I was made of glass, like honesty would shatter me. It was another way of not seeing me, really. I won't make that mistake, Ethan promised, and he meant it. After she left, he stayed in the library until the fire burned down to embers and the first light of dawn began to gray the windows. Something had shifted between them, some understanding reached that felt both dangerous and necessary. They'd agreed to keep their distance, to maintain their walls, but in the agreeing they'd acknowledged that the walls were there, which somehow made them feel less solid. The next morning brought practical challenges that left little time for reflection. The storm that had been threatening finally hit with full force, dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and driving the temperature down until the very air seemed to freeze. The ranch hands worked double shifts, keeping the livestock safe and the pathways clear. In the main house, pipes froze despite everyone's best efforts, and Clara spent half the day working with the handyman to get water flowing again, while Martha inventoried supplies and worried about whether they had enough provisions to last until the roads cleared. Ethan was everywhere at once, in the barns checking on animals, in the bunkhouse making sure the men had enough fuel for heat, on the roof of the main house knocking down ice dams before they could cause damage. He worked until his muscles screamed and his hands were numb, grateful for the physical exhaustion that left no room for the emotional complexity of the previous night. It was late afternoon when he stumbled back into the kitchen, frozen and starving, to find Clara and Martha working side by side to prepare dinner for the ranch hands. The kitchen was warm and steamy, smelling of beef stew and fresh bread, and the contrast with the bitter cold outside was almost overwhelming. "Sit," Martha ordered when she saw him. "You look half dead." Clara, get him coffee and some of that stew. Man can't work on empty. Ethan started to protest, but Clara was already moving, ladling stew into a bowl and pouring coffee from the pot that always seemed to be full on the stove. She set both in front of him without ceremony, then went back to rolling out dough for more bread. He ate in silence, watching the two women work. They'd developed a rhythm already, anticipating each other's movements, communicating with glances and small gestures rather than constant talk. It was the kind of partnership that came from mutual respect and shared competence, and watching it made something in Ethan's chest ache. "We're going to need more firewood brought up to the house," Martha said as she stirred a massive pot of stew. "And someone should check on old Jim in the south bunkhouse. His cough was bad this morning." "I'll handle the firewood," Ethan said. "Samuel can check on Jim." "You'll do no such thing," Martha retorted. "You've been running yourself ragged all day. One of the younger men can bring up wood. You need to sit still for more than 5 minutes before you collapse." "I'm fine." "You're stubborn is what you are," Martha muttered, but there was affection in her voice. She'd been saying the same thing to him for 20 years. Clara glanced over from her bread making, flour dusting her hands and forearms. "The mare's doing well, by the way. I checked on her an hour ago. She ate some grain and she's putting weight on the injured leg. Stitches are holding." "Good," Ethan said, surprised by how much the news relieved him. "That's good." "You did excellent work yesterday," Clara continued, her tone matter of fact. "Steady hands and patience. She's lucky you were here." It was a simple compliment, offered without expectation of response, but it warmed him more than the coffee. He wasn't used to being praised for his skills rather than his success, for what he could do rather than what he had. The evening passed in that same warm, busy atmosphere. More ranch hands came in from the cold, stamping snow from their boots and gathering around the long table where Martha and Clara served stew and bread and coffee. The men talked and joked, their voices filling the kitchen with a kind of rough camaraderie that Ethan usually observed from a distance. But tonight, Clara was in the middle of it all, serving food and responding to teasing with dry humor that surprised everyone, including Ethan. When Robert the Wrangler complimented her bread and asked if she was planning to stay on permanent, she just smiled and said, "That depends on whether you all keep tracking snow into my clean kitchen." "Your kitchen?" Martha said with raised eyebrows. "Well, I work here, don't I? That makes it partly mine. Possession is 9/10 of the law." The men laughed, and Ethan found himself smiling despite himself. There was something different about Clara in this setting. She was still quiet and contained, but there was a spark to her now, a willingness to engage that hadn't been there before. It was as if their conversation last night had given her permission to take up a little more space. Later, after the men had returned to the bunkhouses and the kitchen was clean, Ethan found himself once again unable to settle. He made his way to the stables, ostensibly to check on the mare one final time, but really just needing the quiet and the dark to think. He wasn't alone for long. Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "I thought you might be here," she said. "Wanted to check on her too." They stood together outside the mare's stall, watching the horse doze peacefully, her injuries already beginning to heal. The stable was dark except for the single lantern Ethan had lit, and the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. "You were different tonight," Ethan observed. "With the men. More present." "I decided to take my own advice," Clara said. "I told you last night we were both hiding, both afraid of wanting things. Seemed hypocritical to keep hiding if I was calling you out for doing the same. And how does it feel, being present?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Terrifying, but also good, like I'm remembering how to be a person instead of just someone who performs tasks." Ethan understood exactly what she meant. "I've been performing for 7 years. Being the successful ranch owner, the man who has everything figured out. Sometimes I can't remember who I was before I put on that performance." "You were someone who proposed to a woman with your saved wages instead of borrowed money," Clara said softly. "Someone who came back to save his family's failing ranch instead of walking away. Someone who works alongside his men instead of just giving orders. That person's still there, Mr. Blackwood. You just buried him under all that success." "Ethan," he said suddenly, "if we're going to keep having these late-night conversations where we dismantle each other's defenses, you should probably call me Ethan." Clara smiled, and in the lantern light it transformed her entire face. All right, Ethan, and I'm Clara, not Mrs. Hale. That name belongs to someone I don't want to be anymore. They stayed there until the cold drove them back inside, talking quietly about nothing and everything. Her childhood on the farm, his years in Boston, the ways they'd both learned to armor themselves against disappointment. It wasn't romantic, wasn't leading anywhere. It was just two people learning to be honest with each other in a world that had taught them honesty was dangerous. And that, Ethan realized as he finally climbed the stairs to his too-large bedroom, was its own kind of revolution. The storm lasted 3 days, and in those 3 days, something fundamental shifted in the Blackwood house. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no declarations or confessions, but like ice melting slowly under persistent sun, the careful distance Ethan and Clara had maintained began to soften at the edges. They fell into a pattern without discussing it. Early mornings in the kitchen, where Ethan would appear before dawn to find Clara already preparing coffee, and they'd stand in companionable silence watching the sun struggle to rise over snow-buried fields. Evenings in the library, where Clara would read while Ethan worked on accounts, and occasionally one of them would read a passage aloud just to share something interesting. Late nights in the stables when neither could sleep, checking on animals that didn't really need checking, talking about everything except what was happening between them. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Men who spent their days working cattle and their nights in close quarters missed nothing, and the fact that their boss, who'd turned away 20 elegant brides, was spending his evenings talking with the quiet widow in the stables was fodder for endless speculation. "I'm just saying, it's different," Robert told Samuel one night in the bunkhouse, keeping his voice low. "He smiles now. Not much, but more than I've seen in years. And he doesn't have that look anymore, like he's constantly bracing for something bad. Maybe that's just because he finally got someone working in the house who isn't trying to marry him," Samuel replied, but even he sounded uncertain. He'd watched Ethan for too long not to see the change. "Or maybe," Thomas added from his bunk, "she's not trying to marry him because she understands something all those other women didn't." "And what's that?" Robert asked. "That you can't storm a fortress. You have to wait for the man inside to open the door himself." Samuel smoked his pipe and said nothing, but privately he thought the boy might be right. Inside the fortress, Ethan was discovering that having someone around who expected nothing was paradoxically making him want to give more. Clara never asked him about his day, so he found himself volunteering information over dinner. She never pried into his past, so he started sharing pieces of it unprompted. She never sought his company, which made him seek hers. It was a Tuesday evening, the storm finally broken and the stars fierce in the clear, cold sky, when things shifted again. Ethan had spent the day riding the fence lines with Samuel, checking for damage from the snow and wind. When he returned, exhausted and frozen, he found Clara in the library curled up in one of the chairs by the fire, reading the same Dickens novel she'd chosen that first night. "You're still reading that?" he asked, shrugging out of his coat. "I'm savoring it," Clara replied without looking up. "Books this good shouldn't be rushed. Besides, I know how it ends, and I'm not eager to get there." Ethan moved to pour himself a whiskey, then hesitated. "Would you like something to drink? Whiskey or wine or tea, if there's any made. I'm not much for spirits." "Because of your husband?" The question was out before he could stop it, too personal and too direct. But Clara just closed her book, marking her place carefully. "No. Jacob drank enough for both of us. I just never developed a taste for it. Too much bitter and not enough warmth, if that makes sense." Ethan nodded, setting down his whiskey glass and moving toward the door. "I'll get you tea." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of tea, having abandoned the whiskey entirely. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly when he handed her one and kept the other, but she didn't comment. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the only light in the growing darkness. "Tell me about Boston," Clara said eventually. "What was it like when you were there?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, the tea warming his cold hands. "Loud, crowded, everyone moving fast and talking faster. I spent 2 years there studying agriculture and business methods, living in a boarding house with 6 other students. We thought we were so sophisticated, so modern. We'd go to lectures and museums, debate politics in coffee houses, act like the whole world was opening up in front of us. And Margaret? Where did she fit in all that? She was the daughter of one of my professors. I met her at a university reception. She was serving punch and looking absolutely miserable about it. I asked her why she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, and she told me she was supposed to be charming and decorative, but she'd rather be in the library reading about the world instead of making small talk about it. Clara smiled. I like her already. Everyone liked Margaret. She was smart and funny and beautiful, and she made me feel like I could be someone other than just another ranch heir learning how to turn a profit. We'd walk through the city for hours, talking about everything. She wanted to travel, to see Paris and London and Rome. I wanted to build something meaningful, something that mattered. We made plans, wild, impossible plans about how we'd do both, how we'd make it all work somehow. What happened? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea. Reality happened. My father died, and I had to come home immediately. The ranch was in trouble. Debts I didn't know about, failed investments, years of mismanagement. I had a choice: let it all collapse and stay in Boston with Margaret, or come back and try to save it. I chose the ranch and asked her to come with you. I begged her to come with me. I promised I'd build her the finest house in Montana, that I'd take her traveling once the ranch was stable, that we'd have the life we'd planned just in a different place. She listened to all of it, and then she very calmly explained that she couldn't live in a place where the nearest bookstore was a 3-day journey away, where society meant town dances instead of theater, where she'd be a rancher's wife instead of a professor's daughter. Clara set down her tea, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't wrong for knowing what she could and couldn't live with. The statement surprised him. You're defending her? I'm saying she was honest about her limits. That's not a character flaw, Ethan. Cruel would have been marrying you and making you both miserable. She chose the harder path, hurting you quickly instead of slowly. It didn't feel merciful at the time. I'm sure it didn't, but you survived it. You came back here and turned a failing ranch into the most successful operation in 3 territories. You did exactly what you told her you'd do, just without her. That's not nothing. Ethan looked at Clara, really looked at her in the firelight, and saw understanding in her eyes instead of pity. You keep doing that. Doing what? Reframing things. Taking the stories I tell myself about how I was wronged and showing me different angles. Maybe that's because I spent 3 years telling myself stories about how I was a victim of Jacob's indifference, and it took me a long time to realize I was just as guilty of absence as he was. We teach what we needed to learn. What do you mean you were guilty? You said he was the one who treated you like a transaction. Clara pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable. He did, but I let him. I never fought for something better, never demanded more, never told him that what we had wasn't enough. I just accepted it and told myself I was being practical, being mature, being realistic, but really I was just being a coward. That's not... It is, Clara interrupted gently. I was afraid that if I asked for more and he said no, it would hurt worse than just accepting the nothing we had. So I chose the slow death of indifference over the quick pain of rejection. And then he died, and I realized I'd wasted 3 years of my life being married to a ghost. The raw honesty of it hit Ethan like a physical blow. Is that why you came here? Why you took a job instead of looking for another husband? Partly. After Jacob died, I had offers. 2 men in town who saw a young widow and thought convenient. What? One of them actually told me he needed someone to care for his children and keep his house, and he'd be willing to marry me in exchange, like I was applying for a position. What did you say? I told him I'd rather starve. Clara's smile was sharp and satisfied. Then I went to work for the Morrisons, saved every penny, and promised myself I'd never again let someone treat me like a convenience. When they decided to leave Montana, I had enough saved to last me a few months if I was careful. Coming here was a risk, but it was better than the alternative. Which was? Going back to Pennsylvania and admitting my father was right to sell me to the highest bidder, accepting that I was only worth what I could do for someone else. Becoming small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of dignity people threw my way. Claire's voice was fierce now, all the quiet calm stripped away to reveal the steel underneath. I couldn't do it, Ethan. I couldn't go back to being that version of myself. So I chose uncertainty over shame. Ethan felt something crack open inside him, some long-held wall finally giving way. You're not small or quiet. I am quiet, but that's different from small. I'm learning the difference. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the careful distance of two people avoiding connection, but the comfortable quiet of two people who'd said what needed saying and were content to just exist together. The fire burned low, and neither of them moved to add wood or light more lamps. The darkness felt safer somehow, less exposing. I don't know how to do this, Ethan said finally, his voice rough. Do what? Whatever this is. I don't know how to be around someone who sees through all my careful defenses and doesn't use it against me. I don't know how to trust that you're not waiting for the right moment to ask for something. Clara uncurled herself from the chair and stood, moving to the window where she could see the snow-covered ranch stretching out under the stars. I'm not waiting for anything, Ethan. I meant what I said. I don't want a husband. I don't want promises or commitments, or any of the things that turned sour last time. I just want to be here, doing work that matters, talking to someone who understands what it's like to be afraid of wanting things. If that's all this ever is, it's already more than I had before. But what if it becomes more? The question escaped before Ethan could trap it, vulnerable and terrifying. Clara turned to look at him, and in the dim light, he couldn't read her expression. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But we can't live our lives being afraid of what might go wrong, Ethan. Margaret hurt you, Jacob hurt me, and we both learned to protect ourselves. But protection and prison are sometimes the same thing. She left him there with those words hanging in the air, and Ethan sat alone in the darkness for a long time after, turning them over in his mind like stones he was examining for flaws. Protection and prison. He'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. He'd built walls to keep hurt out, but he'd also locked himself in. The question was whether he was brave enough to open the door. The next morning brought a complication neither of them had anticipated. Ethan was in the barn when Samuel found him, wearing an expression that promised trouble. "Boss, we've got visitors. Henry Hendrickson and his wife just pulled up." Ethan's jaw tightened. Hendrickson was the father of one of the rejected brides, a railroad man with more ambition than sense, and a tendency to see every interaction as a negotiation. What does he want? Says he needs to speak with you about a business matter, but his wife is with him, and she's already making her way to the main house with Martha. My guess? They're here to try one more time. I already said no to their daughter. I know that, and you know that. Clearly they think you just need more convincing. Ethan bit back a curse and headed toward the house, Samuel trailing behind him. He found Hendrickson in his study, uninvited and far too comfortable, while the sounds of female voices drifted from the direction of the kitchen. "Mr. Blackwood," Hendrickson boomed, standing to shake hands with a grip that was too firm and a smile that was too wide. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you're busy, but I have a proposition that I think will interest you." "I'm not interested in your daughter, Hendrickson. I made that clear when she was here. And I respect that, I do. But hear me out. You're building an empire here, Blackwood. Everyone can see that. But an empire needs alliances, connections, ways to move goods, and access markets. My railroad connections could be invaluable to your operation. Together, we could—" "Together?" Ethan repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean if I marry your daughter, you'll use your influence to benefit my ranch? That's what you're offering." "I'm offering partnership, mutual benefit. Your cattle could ship on my lines at reduced rates. My contacts could open doors in Chicago and New York. All I ask in return is that you reconsider Elizabeth. She's a good girl, educated, well-mannered. She'd make an excellent wife for a man in your position." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. "My position. You know what I mean. A man of your wealth and standing needs a wife who can represent him properly in society, who can host the right people and make the right connections. Elizabeth can do that." "And what does Elizabeth want?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Did you ask her if she wanted to marry a man who already rejected her once, or did you just tell her this was good business?" Hendrickson's smile faltered slightly. Elizabeth understands her duty to the family. She's willing to— Stop. Ethan's voice cut through the room like a blade. Get out of my house. Now see here, I'm offering you— You're offering me a transaction dressed up as a marriage. You're offering to trade your daughter like she's cattle to be bartered. The answer is no, Hendrickson. It was no when Elizabeth was here, and it's no now. My ranch succeeds or fails on its own merits, not because I sold myself to railroad connections. Hendrickson's face reddened. You're making a mistake, Blackwood. A man can't build an empire alone. You need alliances. You need family connections. I need, Ethan said, his voice dropping to something cold and final, you to leave, now, and take your wife with you. He turned and walked out, leaving Hendrickson sputtering behind him. In the kitchen, he found Martha and Mrs. Hendrickson having tea, with Clara standing slightly apart, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes watchful. Mrs. Hendrickson, Ethan said, his tone clipped, I'm afraid you and your husband need to leave. We won't be discussing marriage arrangements today or any day. Mrs. Hendrickson set down her cup with more force than necessary. You're being unreasonable, Mr. Blackwood. Elizabeth is a lovely girl from a good family. I'm sure she is. I hope she finds someone who wants to marry her for herself, not for her father's business connections. That person is not me. He held the woman's gaze until she looked away, then waited in tense silence while she gathered her things and huffed out to find her husband. When they were gone, Samuel closing the door firmly behind them, Ethan felt the tension drain out of him all at once. Well, Martha said cheerfully, that was entertaining. Man had the nerve to tell me his daughter's pot roast was famous in 3 counties. I told him my pot roast was famous in 5, and I wasn't trying to marry anybody. Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. Then he looked at Clara, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You all right? She asked quietly. I'm fine. Just tired of people who think everything has a price. Not everything does, Clara said, and something in her tone made him look at her more closely. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to help Martha clean up the tea things. That night, Ethan found himself once again in the library, unable to settle. He poured whiskey this time, needing the burn of it, trying to quiet the anger that still simmered under his skin. He was staring into the fire when Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, her hair loose. You're brooding, she observed. I'm thinking. Same thing in your case. She came in and sat in her usual chair, drawing her feet up underneath her. Want to talk about it? Hendrickson offered me his daughter like she was a commodity, like marriage was just another business transaction he was negotiating. And the worst part is she probably agreed to it, probably sat there while he planned it all out and just nodded along because that's what dutiful daughters do. Maybe, Clara said carefully, or maybe she's like I was, so convinced she doesn't deserve better that she'll take whatever's offered and call it fortune. The words hit him like cold water. Is that what you think? That those women who came here were just settling? Some of them, probably. The same way I settled for Jacob. The same way you almost settled for being alone forever rather than risk being hurt again. We all settle for something, Ethan. The question is whether we're settling out of fear or wisdom. And how do you tell the difference? Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think wisdom makes you feel peaceful. Fear makes you feel safe. They look similar from the outside, but inside they're completely different. So which one am I? When I send those women away, when I refuse every offer, am I being wise or just afraid? I can't answer that for you. Only you know what peace feels like versus safety. Ethan drained his whiskey, the burn doing nothing to ease the knot in his chest. I don't think I know the difference anymore. I've been safe for so long I've forgotten what peace feels like. Clara stood and crossed to him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she deliberately closed the distance between them. She sat on the arm of his chair, close enough that he could smell the soap she used, see the way the firelight caught in her loose hair. Then maybe it's time to remember, she said softly. Maybe it's time to stop being so safe all the time. Clara, I'm not saying you should marry someone you don't love. I'm not saying you should accept Hendrickson's deal or any of the other offers. I'm saying maybe you should stop treating every potential connection like it's a threat. Maybe you should let someone close enough to see if peace is possible. And if it's not, If I let someone in and it all goes wrong again? Then at least you'll know. At least you'll have tried for something real instead of just avoiding something painful. She stood then, moving away before he could respond, before he could reach for her or pull her back or do any of the foolish things his heart was suddenly screaming at him to do. "Good night, Ethan," she said from the doorway. "Sleep well." But he didn't sleep well. He lay awake in his too large bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls he'd built starting to crumble around him. And the most terrifying part wasn't the crumbling. It was the fact that he was starting to hope there might be something worth building in the rubble. The morning after his sleepless night found Ethan at the kitchen table before dawn, nursing coffee and trying to make sense of the chaos in his head. Martha moved around him quietly, respecting his mood, until Clara came down and the whole dynamic shifted. She didn't ask if he was all right or try to draw him into conversation. She just poured herself coffee, took the chair across from him, and sat in companionable silence while the sky slowly lightened outside the window. It was Samuel who broke the morning's peace, bursting through the back door with snow on his shoulders and urgency in his face. "Boss, we've got a situation. The north fence line is down. Looks like the weight of the snow finally gave way. Cattle are starting to drift, and if we don't get them rounded up soon, we'll lose them to the weather or the wolves." Ethan was on his feet instantly, the personal turmoil of the previous night shoved aside in favor of immediate crisis. "How many men do we have available?" "Most of them. But it's going to take all day, maybe longer. That's a lot of ground to cover, and the snow's still deep in places." "Get everyone mounted and ready. I'll be out in 10 minutes. Ethan turned to Martha. "Pack food and coffee that'll last, enough for 12 men working all day." "I'll help," Claire said, already moving toward the pantry. "Clara, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. Besides, you'll need extra hands if you're going to cover that much ground." "Absolutely not," Ethan said firmly. "It's too dangerous, too cold. I grew up on a farm, remember? I can ride, I can rope, and I'm not afraid of cold or cattle. You need everyone you can get, and I'm capable." Martha made a sound that might have been approval. "Girl's got a point, boss. Pride won't find your cattle faster." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to insist she stay safe in the warm house. But the practical part of his brain, the part that had built his empire on smart decisions rather than emotional ones, knew she was right. They needed every capable body they could get. "Fine. But you stay close to me or Samuel. No wandering off, no taking unnecessary risks. Understood?" Clara's smile was small but triumphant. "Understood." 30 minutes later, they rode out into a landscape transformed by snow and wind. The world was white and blue and brutally cold, the kind of cold that bit through layers of wool and leather and settled into bones. Clara rode beside Ethan on a sturdy gelding from the stables, her face wrapped in a scarf and her eyes sharp with focus. They found the broken fence line exactly where Samuel had said, posts snapped under the weight of accumulated snow, wire tangled and useless in the drifts. Beyond it, tracks led in multiple directions as cattle had wandered through the breach in search of shelter or food. Ethan divided the men into groups, each taking a section of the range to search. He and Samuel took the northeast quadrant, and Clara came with them despite his lingering reservations. They rode for hours, the landscape endless and exhausting, calling out to each other when they spotted cattle and working together to turn the frightened animals back toward the main herd. It was hard, brutal work. The cattle were scattered and stubborn. The snow made the horses stumble, and the cold was relentless. But Clara kept pace with both men, never complaining, her hands steady on the reins and her voice calm when calling to the cattle. Ethan found himself watching her when he should have been watching the terrain, struck by the way she moved with the horse as if they were one creature, the way she anticipated what needed doing before he had to ask. "She's good," Samuel said quietly when they paused to rest the horses. Clara was a few yards away, checking the cinch on her saddle. "Real good. Not many city women could handle this." "She's not a city woman," Ethan replied, and heard the defensive note in his own voice. "She grew up working." "I know that. I'm just saying, you hired well, boss. That's all." But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Samuel's knowing look said everything his words didn't, and Ethan turned away to hide whatever was showing on his face. They worked through midday and into afternoon, slowly gathering the scattered cattle and driving them back toward the ranch. The other groups were having similar success. and by the time the sun started its descent, they'd accounted for most of the herd. They were cold and exhausted and triumphant, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from meaningful work well done. It was on the ride back, with the cattle moving ahead of them in a steady flow and the worst of the crisis over, that Clara's horse stepped into a hidden hole beneath the snow. The gelding stumbled badly, going down on one knee, and Clara pitched forward over his neck. Ethan's heart stopped. He was off his own horse before conscious thought, running through the snow as Clara rolled clear of the flailing gelding. By the time he reached her, she was sitting up, breathing hard but apparently intact. "Are you hurt?" His hands were on her shoulders, then checking her arms, her head, looking for injury with something close to panic. "I'm fine," Clara said, but her voice was shaky. "Just got the wind knocked out of me. Is the horse all right?" Ethan barely spared a glance for the gelding, who was back on his feet and looking more embarrassed than injured. "The horse is fine. You could have broken your neck." "But I didn't. I'm fine, Ethan, really." But he couldn't seem to let go of her shoulders, couldn't seem to stop looking at her, like he was trying to convince himself she was truly unhurt. The fear that had shot through him when she fell was still racing through his veins, making his hands unsteady and his breath short. "Ethan," Clara said softly, her gloved hands coming up to cover his. "I'm all right. You can let go." "I don't want to," he said, and the honesty of it shocked them both. They stared at each other in the snow, surrounded by cattle and ranch hands who were politely pretending not to notice, and something shifted irrevocably between them. All the careful distance they'd maintained, all the walls they'd agreed to keep standing, it all felt suddenly fragile and foolish. "Boss?" "Boss?" Samuel called from a few yards away. "We should keep moving before the cattle start wandering again." The moment broke. Ethan helped Clara to her feet, checked the gelding thoroughly despite his earlier dismissal, and got them both mounted again. But something had changed, and he could feel Clara feeling it too. The way she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way the air between them felt charged with something unnamed. They made it back to the ranch as darkness fell, the cattle secure and the fence line temporarily patched. The men headed to the bunkhouse for hot food and sleep, but Ethan found himself following Clara back to the main house, unable to let her out of his sight. In the kitchen, Martha took one look at them and started heating water for baths and preparing food without asking questions. Clara's cheeks were red with cold, her hair escaping from her braid, snow clinging to her coat. She looked exhausted and beautiful and alive, and Ethan couldn't stop thinking about how close she'd come to being seriously hurt. "Stop looking at me like that," Clara said, pulling off her gloves. "Like what?" "Like I'm about to shatter. I told you, I'm fine. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. That's the nature of risk, Ethan. Sometimes bad things happen, sometimes they don't. You can't control everything. I should never have let you come." Clara turned to face him fully, her eyes flashing with something between frustration and affection. "You didn't let me do anything. I chose to come. I chose to help, and I'd choose it again, even knowing I'd fall. Stop trying to protect me from choices I'm capable of making myself." "I'm not trying to—" "You are. You're trying to keep me safe the same way you keep yourself safe, by not allowing anything uncertain or risky or potentially painful. But that's not living, Ethan. That's just existing very carefully." She walked out before he could respond, leaving him standing in the kitchen with Martha, who was very deliberately not looking at him. "Don't," he warned. "Don't what? I didn't say anything." "You're thinking very loudly." Martha smiled into her soup pot. "All I'm thinking is that girl's got your number, and it's about time somebody did." Ethan wanted to argue, but he was too tired and too rattled and too full of feelings he couldn't name. Instead, he went to his study, poured whiskey he didn't drink, and stared at nothing while his mind replayed the moment Clara's horse stumbled, the eternal second before he knew she was all right. He'd been terrified. Not the careful, controlled fear he allowed himself when making business decisions, but raw, visceral terror that came from the possibility of losing something that mattered. And that realization, that Clara mattered, that she'd somehow become essential without him noticing, was more frightening than any physical danger. She was right, he realized. He'd been so busy protecting himself from pain that he'd forgotten how to feel anything at all. 7 years of safety, of control, of making sure nothing could hurt him, and in 1 month, This quiet widow, with her sharp observations and gentle honesty, had undone all of it. The question was what he was going to do about it. He found her later that night in the library, as he'd somehow known he would. She was in her robe again, her hair down, reading by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or acceptance. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Can't stop thinking," he replied. And instead of taking his usual chair, he sat on the sofa near hers, closer than they'd ever been voluntarily. "Clara, I need to tell you something." She set down her book, giving him her full attention. "All right. When you fell today, I thought—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I've spent 7 years making sure I never cared about anything enough to be devastated by losing it. I built this ranch, I made myself successful, but I kept it all at arm's length. No attachments, no vulnerabilities, nothing that could be taken away and leave me broken like Margaret did." "I know," Clara said softly. "But watching you fall, not knowing if you were hurt, it made me realize I've failed completely at keeping you at arm's length. Somehow, without me noticing, you've become something I care about. Someone I care about. And that terrifies me." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of being safe. Because you were right when you said I was treating every connection like a threat. Because I don't want to wake up in another 7 years and realize I wasted them being afraid." "Ethan, I'm not asking you for anything," he interrupted quickly. "I know you said you don't want a husband, don't want commitments or promises. I'm not asking you to change that. I just needed you to know that whatever walls I was trying to maintain, they're gone. You've seen through every defense I have, and I'm done pretending you haven't." Clara stood then, moving to the window, her back to him. When she spoke, her voice was tight with emotion. "Do you know what I thought about when that horse fell? In that split second before I hit the ground?" "What?" "I thought about how stupid I'd been. Not about falling, about wasting the last month being so careful and controlled and safe. I've been here for 4 weeks, and I've spent every day trying not to want things, trying not to feel things, trying not to admit that being around you has made me start hoping again when I'd convinced myself hope was dangerous." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I told you I didn't want a husband, and I meant it. I don't want what I had with Jacob, that empty transactional thing where we shared a house but never shared ourselves. But what I found here, what we've been building in these late-night conversations and shared silences, that's not nothing, Ethan. That's something I didn't even know I wanted until I had it." Ethan stood, crossing the distance between them slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. She didn't move. He stopped close enough to see the firelight reflected in her eyes, close enough to count the freckles across her nose that he'd never noticed before. "So, what do we do?" he asked quietly. "We're both terrified. We're both convinced this is a terrible idea. We both have every reason to walk away." "But we're not going to, are we?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "No, I don't think we are." "Then I suppose we do what we've been doing. We take it one day at a time. We're honest when we can be and patient when we can't. We don't make promises we're not ready to keep, but we stop pretending we're not making something here." "That's terrifying," Ethan said. "Yes," Clara agreed, "but staying safe is starting to feel more frightening than taking the risk." He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, and that small gesture felt more significant than any declaration. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to care about someone without waiting for them to leave. I don't know how to let someone care about me without expecting them to use it against me," Claire replied. "So I suppose we'll just have to figure it out together." They stood like that for a long moment, close but not quite touching, trembling on the edge of something that felt both inevitable and impossible. Then Clara did something brave. She closed the last few inches between them and rested her forehead against his chest, a gesture of trust so profound it made Ethan's breath catch. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she were made of something precious and breakable, and felt her hands come up to grip his shirt. They didn't kiss, didn't make promises, didn't declare anything definite. They just held each other in the firelight and acknowledged silently that something had changed, that the careful distance they'd maintained was gone, that they were choosing to be afraid together instead of safe apart. This is probably a mistake, Clara murmured against his chest. Probably, Ethan agreed and felt her laugh softly. We're both going to panic at some point and try to run. Almost certainly. We should at least try to warn each other when we're about to bolt. That seems fair? Clara pulled back enough to look up at him, and her smile was tremulous but genuine. What do we tell people? Martha's going to know something's different. Samuel already suspects. We tell them the truth, Ethan said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. That we're two people who are tired of being alone, who are trying to figure out if it's possible to build something real without all the games and expectations that ruined it before. And if they ask if we're courting, are we? Clara considered the question seriously. I think we're doing something that doesn't have a name yet, something that's just ours. Is that all right? That's more than all right, Ethan said, and meant it with everything in him. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and the cold started seeping in through the windows. When they finally separated, it was with reluctance, like two people who'd been drowning and had just found air. Clara kissed his cheek, light and quick and devastating, then left him standing alone in the dark library with his heart racing and his defenses in ruins. He should have been terrified. He was terrified. But beneath the fear was something else, something that felt suspiciously like peace. The next morning, the ranch woke to gossip. One of the younger hands had apparently been looking for a lost glove and had glanced through the library window the previous night, seeing the boss holding Mrs. Hale in what looked like considerably more than an employer-employee relationship. By breakfast, every man on the ranch knew something had changed. Samuel found Ethan in the barn and didn't even pretend to be subtle. So, you and Clara. There's no me and Clara, Ethan said, checking a mare's hooves with more attention than strictly necessary. Son, I've known you since you were in short pants. Don't lie to me. Ethan straightened, meeting the older man's eyes. We're figuring something out. That's all I can tell you because it's all I know. Samuel's face softened. Is she good to you? The question surprised Ethan. Not is she good enough for you, or does she want your money, but simply, is she good to you? As if that was all that mattered. She sees me, Ethan said quietly. Not the ranch, not the money, not what I can provide. Just me. And somehow she's decided I'm worth the trouble of knowing. Then that's all that matters, boss. Everything else is just details. In the kitchen, Clara was having a similar conversation with Martha, who'd simply looked at her over breakfast and said, So, you and Ethan. Clara sighed. Does everyone on this ranch have eyes everywhere? Small community, dear. Not much happens that doesn't get noticed. The question is, are you happy? Clara considered the question, really considered it, then slowly nodded. I think I'm starting to be. I'm terrified, and I don't know what we're doing, and it could all fall apart spectacularly. But yes, I think I'm happy. Then the rest is just noise, Martha said firmly. You're both adults, you're both smart enough to know what you're doing, and more importantly, you're both brave enough to try despite being scared. That's worth something. The days that followed fell into a new pattern, one that was familiar and yet entirely transformed. They still had their morning coffee in the kitchen, but now Ethan's hand would brush Clara's when reaching for the pot, and they'd both pretend not to notice the electricity in that brief contact. They still spent evenings in the library, but now they shared the sofa instead of separate chairs, their shoulders touching, comfortable in a closeness they'd both been starving for without realizing it. They talked about everything, his plans for expanding the ranch, her memories of Pennsylvania, the books they loved, the things they feared. Clara told him about the first time her father hit her mother, how she'd learned to make herself small and quiet to avoid becoming a target. Ethan told her about watching his own father work himself to death trying to save the ranch, about the weight of carrying that legacy. They didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever, no defining of what they were to each other. They just existed together, learning each other, building trust with the patience of two people who'd both been hurt by rushing before. But there were moments that felt like promises even without words. The way Ethan's hand would find the small of Clara's back when they walked through the house, steadying and possessive. The way Clara would touch his face sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, her fingers gentle against his jaw as if confirming he was real. The way they'd both started sleeping better, as if the simple knowledge that someone understood them was enough to quiet the nightmares. It was 2 weeks after their conversation in the library when Clara found Ethan in his study late one night, bent over ledgers with exhaustion evident in every line of his body. She didn't say anything, just came up behind him and started rubbing the tension from his shoulders with strong, capable hands. Ethan groaned, his head falling forward. "You don't have to do that." "I know. I want to." They were silent for a while. The only sounds the crackling fire and Ethan's occasional sighs of relief as Clara worked knots out of muscles gone tight from cold and stress. Finally, he reached up and caught one of her hands, pulling her around to face him. "Move in," he said. Clara blinked. "I already live here." "No, I mean—" He stopped, struggling for words. Stop sleeping in the guest room. Stay with me. Not because I'm asking for anything more than what we have, but because I'm tired of walking past your door every night and pretending I don't want you close. I'm tired of waking up alone when you're just down the hall. I just want—" "Yes," Clara interrupted softly. "Yes?" "Yes, I want that too." That night, Clara moved her few belongings into Ethan's room, and they lay awake together talking until dawn, their bodies curled together under heavy quilts, safe and warm and no longer alone. They didn't make love, both of them somehow knowing they weren't quite ready for that yet, that there were still walls to dismantle and fears to face. But they held each other through the night, and that felt like its own kind of intimacy, its own kind of promise. And for the first time in 7 years, Ethan Blackwood fell asleep with his heart unguarded and his defenses down, and didn't dream of betrayal or loss. He dreamed instead of spring coming to frozen ground, of ice melting and things growing, of a future that looked nothing like the fortress he'd built, but everything like home. Spring came slowly to Montana that year, as if the land itself was reluctant to let go of winter's grip. But inside the Blackwood house, warmth had already taken root in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. The change was evident in small things, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for years, the way lamplight seemed softer somehow, the fact that breakfast was no longer a solitary ritual but a shared moment of connection before the day's work began. Ethan woke one morning in late March to find Clara already awake beside him, propped on one elbow and watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching in her hair and making her eyes look more silver than blue. "How long have you been awake?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Long enough to realize something," Clara said, and there was a seriousness in her tone that made him fully alert. "We've been doing this for almost 3 months now, living together, building something, and we've never talked about what happens next." Ethan's chest tightened with familiar fear. "Do we need to talk about it?" "I think we do. Because I've been lying here watching you sleep, and I realized I'm not afraid anymore." She paused, then corrected herself. "No, that's not true. I'm terrified. But I'm more afraid of not saying what I feel than I am of saying it and having it go wrong." He sat up, the blankets pooling around his waist, suddenly awake and wary. "Clara, let me say this, please, before I lose my nerve." She took a breath, steadying herself. "When I came here, I told myself I just wanted work and stability and a place to start over. I told myself I didn't want or need anything else. But I was lying. I was lying because wanting things had hurt me before, and I thought if I just stopped wanting, I'd stop hurting." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I did the same thing, aim. But here's what I've learned these past months. Not wanting things doesn't stop you from getting them. It just stops you from appreciating them when they arrive. And somewhere between making coffee in your kitchen and falling asleep in your arms, I stopped pretending I didn't want this. I stopped pretending I didn't want you." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and brave. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, some last wall he hadn't realized he was still holding up. "I love you," Clara said simply, and the words were like a key turning in a lock. "I don't need you, and you don't need me. And maybe that's exactly why this works. But I love you anyway. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and the way you pretend not to care about things you care about deeply. I love how you treat your men with respect and your horses with patience. I love that you let me be myself without trying to make me into something more convenient or comfortable. Ethan found he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at her in wonder. "I'm not asking you to say it back," Clara continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments or any of the things that scared us both before. I just needed you to know. I needed to stop being so careful and just tell you the truth." Finally, Ethan found his voice. "The night you fell from your horse, when I thought you might be hurt, I realized something. I realized I'd been so busy protecting myself from another Margaret that I'd missed what was right in front of me. You're nothing like her. This is nothing like that was. And I've been a fool for not seeing it sooner." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since that first morning when you stood in my kitchen and told me you wanted nothing from me except fair wages for fair work. I just couldn't admit it, because admitting it meant risking everything I'd built to protect myself." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "So what do we do now?" "I think," Ethan said slowly, pulling her close, "we stop protecting ourselves from each other. We stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. We just love each other as honestly and imperfectly as we can manage and trust that it's enough." "That simple?" "That complicated," he corrected, and kissed her for the first time since she'd moved into his room, kissed her like a man who'd finally stopped running from his own heart. They lay tangled together as the sun rose higher, talking about everything and nothing, making plans and promises they were finally brave enough to keep. For the first time, Ethan spoke about a future that included someone else, and it didn't feel like a trap or a transaction. It felt like possibility. But spring in Montana was never simple, and neither was building a life together. The first real test came a week later when a rider arrived at the ranch carrying a letter addressed to Ethan in familiar handwriting that made his blood run cold. Margaret. He stood in his study holding the envelope, his hands oddly steady despite the chaos in his mind. Clara found him there, took one look at his face, and closed the door behind her. "What is it?" "A letter. From Margaret Cheltenham." He couldn't quite bring himself to open it. Clara crossed to him, taking the envelope from his hands and setting it on the desk. "Do you want to read it alone?" "No," Ethan said immediately. "No, I don't want anything alone anymore. That was the whole problem before. I dealt with everything in isolation and convinced myself it was strength. Stay with me?" "Always," Clara said, and the simple certainty of it gave him courage. He opened the letter, Clara standing close enough that he could feel her warmth, her presence anchoring him. The words were written in Margaret's elegant hand, and reading them felt like opening a door he'd thought was locked forever. "Dearest Ethan, I hope this letter finds you well. I know you must be surprised to hear from me after so many years of silence. I've written this letter a dozen times and torn it up just as many, but I've finally found the courage to send it. I'm writing because I've heard through mutual acquaintances that you've built something remarkable in Montana, not just a successful ranch, but a life. I'm writing because I owe you an apology that's 7 years overdue. I was wrong, Ethan. Wrong about Montana. Wrong about what kind of life was worth living. Wrong about what really matters. I spent these years in Boston becoming exactly what I thought I wanted to be: educated, cultured, comfortable. I married a professor, live in a fine house, attend all the right social functions, and I'm absolutely miserable. It took me far too long to realize that comfort and security aren't the same as happiness, that a life that looks impressive from the outside can feel hollow on the inside, that I traded the possibility of genuine love for the guarantee of convenience, and it was the worst bargain I've ever made. I'm not writing to ask you to take me back. I know too much time has passed, and I wounded you too deeply for that. I'm writing to tell you that you were right to believe that love and partnership matter more than circumstance. You were right to want someone who would choose you over comfort. You deserved that then, and I hope with all my heart that you've found it now. I will carry the regret of losing you for the rest of my life. But I hope knowing that you were right about everything brings you some peace. Be well, Ethan. Be happy. Build the life you dreamed of. And know that wherever you are, I wish you every joy I was too afraid to help you create." With sincere regret, Margaret Ethan read the letter twice, then set it down carefully on his desk. He waited for the anger, the vindication, the satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, all he felt was a distant sadness for the woman he'd once loved and the years they'd both wasted being afraid. "How do you feel?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan turned to her, seeing her clearly. This woman who'd been brave enough to want nothing so she could freely choose everything, who'd walked into his fortress and shown him how to dismantle it from the inside. "I feel sorry for her," he said honestly, "and grateful." "Grateful?" "If she hadn't left, I would never have built this place. I would never have become the person I needed to be to appreciate you. Everything that hurt me before was just preparation for everything that matters now." Clara's smile was tremulous. "That's a very generous way of looking at it." "It's the truth. Margaret made her choice based on fear, and she regrets it. I made my choices based on pain, and I'm grateful for where they led me. The difference is that I found someone brave enough to choose differently." He pulled Clara close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "You chose me, not because I could give you security, but because we gave each other honesty. That's worth more than comfort, more than status, more than any of the things Margaret or I thought mattered back then." "So what will you do with the letter?" Ethan glanced at it, then at the fireplace. "I think I'll burn it, not out of anger, but because that chapter is closed. Margaret deserves to find her own happiness, and I deserve to stop defining myself by how I was hurt. We both deserve to move forward." He took the letter and tossed it into the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Clara stood beside him, her hand in his, and together they watched 7 years of pain and protection burn away. "I have something I want to ask you," Ethan said as the last of the letter disintegrated. "And I need you to know I'm not asking because of Margaret's letter, or because I'm trying to prove anything. I'm asking because it's what I want, and I think it's what you want too." Clara turned to face him, her expression open and curious. "Marry me," Ethan said. "Not because it's practical or convenient or socially expected. Not because you need my protection or I need your legitimacy. Marry me because we've built something real here, something honest and imperfect and worth making permanent. Marry me because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Clara's breath caught. "Ethan, I know you said you'd been married once and once was enough. I know you came here specifically because you didn't want another husband. But that was before. Before we learned to trust each other, before we built this thing between us that doesn't have a name but feels like forever anyway. I'm not asking you to be what you were with Jacob. I'm asking you to be what you are right now, yourself, completely. But to do it as my wife." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but she was smiling through them. "You're supposed to wait until the woman has a chance to answer before you keep talking." "Then answer," Ethan said, and for the first time in 7 years he let hope live in his voice. "Yes," Claire said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to building something permanent and imperfect and real. Yes to all of it." They sealed the promise with a kiss that felt like a beginning and an ending all at once, the end of being alone, the beginning of being found. When they finally pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying, giddy with the relief of finally letting themselves want something without armor. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. Martha cried and hugged them both, declaring she'd known from the first morning that they were meant for each other. Samuel shook Ethan's hand with quiet pride, then pulled him into a rare embrace and whispered, "About damn time, son." The ranch hands celebrated with a rowdy party in the bunkhouse that lasted well into the night, complete with terrible singing and slightly better dancing. But it was Robert the Wrangler who said what everyone was thinking when he raised his glass in a toast that evening. To the boss who turned away every bride who came looking for his fortune, and to the woman who came looking for work and found something better. May the rest of us be half as brave when love shows up unexpected. They were married 6 weeks later on a clear May morning when the world was green again and possibility felt like something you could hold in your hands. It was a small ceremony, just the ranch hands and house staff, a traveling preacher who happened through town, and Martha crying happy tears throughout the entire proceeding. Clara wore a simple dress she'd made herself, cream-colored and practical and beautiful in its understated elegance. Ethan wore his best suit, the one he'd bought years ago for business meetings he no longer needed to impress anyone at. They stood in the ranch house parlor, the windows open to let in spring air and the sound of horses in the distance, and made promises to each other that felt nothing like the promises either had made before. "I promise to see you," Ethan said when it was his turn to speak. Not just look at you, but truly see you. Your fears and your strength, your wounds and your wisdom. I promise to love you not for what you do for me, but for who you are. I promise to be brave enough to be imperfect with you, to let you see me at my worst and trust that you'll stay. I promise to build a life with you, not just beside you, and to choose you every day, even when it's difficult. Clara's voice was steady despite her tears. I promise to trust you with my honesty, even when honesty feels dangerous. I promise to want you openly instead of carefully, to love you without reservation instead of protection. I promise to remind you that you're more than your success, more than your ranch, more than anything you can build or buy. I promise to be your partner in everything, the hard work and the joy, the fear and the hope, all of it. When the preacher pronounced them married, Ethan kissed his wife like a man who'd spent 7 years learning the difference between safety and happiness, and Clara kissed her husband like a woman who'd stopped settling for survival and started reaching for life. The celebration that followed was joyful and uncomplicated. Good food and better company, dancing in the barn and laughter that echoed through the evening. Ethan found himself standing at the edge of it all, at one point, watching Clara dance with Samuel while the ranch hands clapped along and Samuel appeared at his elbow. You did good, boss, the foreman said quietly. Real good. I got lucky, Ethan replied. Nah, luck is finding something valuable by accident. You built this. You made yourself into someone worthy of her, and she made herself brave enough to want you. That's not luck, that's work. Ethan thought about that as he watched his wife spin in the lamplight, her face glowing with happiness. Samuel was right. This wasn't something that had simply happened to them. It was something they'd chosen, day after day, conversation after conversation, risk after risk. They'd both been broken in different ways, and instead of letting that brokenness define them, they'd used it to understand each other. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Ethan and Clara stood together on the balcony off their bedroom, looking out at the ranch spread beneath the stars. Clara leaned back against Ethan's chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, both of them content in the silence. Do you remember what you said to me that first night in the library? Clara asked softly. About not knowing how to want something without waiting for it to be taken away? I remember. Are you still waiting? Ethan considered the question seriously, taking stock of the fear he'd carried for so long. To his surprise, he found it had diminished to almost nothing, not gone entirely because fear was part of being human, but reduced to something manageable, something that no longer controlled him. No, he said, and felt the truth of it settle in his bones. I'm not waiting for loss anymore. I'm just grateful for what's here. Good, Claire said, turning in his arms to face him. Because I'm not going anywhere. Not for comfort, not for security, not for any of the things that might have seemed more important once. I'm staying for this, for you, for us, for the life we're building together. Even when it's hard? Ethan asked, needing to hear it. Especially when it's hard. That's when it matters most. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd been alone for so long. They'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly known, now wrapped in each other and the promise of more mornings like this. More evenings of comfortable silence, more years of imperfect and honest love. The years that followed proved them both right and wrong in equal measure. Marriage wasn't always easy. They fought sometimes, misunderstood each other occasionally, had to work through old wounds that resurfaced unexpectedly. But they did the work. They chose each other even on the days when choosing felt difficult. They were honest when honesty hurt, patient when patience was needed, and brave enough to keep showing up even when fear whispered that retreat was safer. The ranch continued to prosper, but Ethan stopped measuring success only in terms of profit and land. He measured it in the sound of Clara's laughter echoing through rooms that used to be silent, in the children that eventually came and filled the house with noise and life, in the way his men looked at their boss and saw not just an employer, but a man who'd figured out what really mattered. Clara bloomed in ways neither of them had anticipated. She took over managing the household accounts and proved to have a head for business that rivaled Ethan's own. She started a small school for the ranch hands' children, teaching them to read and write in the kitchen during the long winter months. She raised their children with the same combination of fierce love and practical wisdom that had drawn Ethan to her in the first place. And on cold winter nights, when neither could sleep, They'd sometimes find themselves in that same library where they'd first started being honest with each other, and they'd talk about how far they'd come from the people they'd been. The cold, defensive ranch owner who'd turned away 20 brides. The quiet widow who'd convinced herself she wanted nothing. Two people who'd armed themselves against pain and almost missed out on joy entirely. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come here that day?" Clara asked one such night, years into their marriage, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. "I try not to," Ethan admitted, "because the answer is probably that I'd still be alone in this big house, still convinced that being untouchable was the same as being strong. And I'd probably be working somewhere else, still believing that not wanting anything was the same as being content." "We were both such cowards," Ethan said, but there was affection in his voice, forgiveness for their younger selves. "We were both just scared," Clara corrected gently. "And then we found each other and learned how to be brave." Ethan kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "You know what the strangest part is? I spent years looking for someone who wanted me for me, not for what I could provide. But you taught me that it's not that simple. You wanted me, yes, but you also wanted the life we could build, the security we could create together, the partnership of shared work and shared dreams. And that wasn't wrong. It was honest." "Margaret was wrong about what mattered," Clara said thoughtfully. "But you were wrong, too, in thinking that loving what you'd built somehow made love less real. Real love isn't either or, it's both and. I love you, and I love the life we share. Those things aren't separate. They're woven together so tightly, I can't tell where one ends and the other begins." "When did you get so wise?" Ethan asked, smiling in the darkness. "When I married a man stubborn enough to make me think harder about everything I believed." Clara shifted to look up at him, her face barely visible in the dying firelight, but her eyes bright and certain. "We almost missed this, you know. We almost let fear win. If I'd been too proud to ask for work, if you'd been too defensive to see me as anything but another woman after your money, if either of us had been just a little less brave at just the right moment, we would have missed everything that mattered." "But we didn't," Ethan said firmly. "We were brave enough. And we keep being brave enough every day, every choice." "Every day," Clara agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the Montana landscape in fresh white. But inside the black wood house, warmth had taken permanent residence. In the kitchen, bread dough was rising for tomorrow's breakfast. In the bedrooms upstairs, children slept safely under quilts their mother had sewn. In the library, two people who'd once been determined to face the world alone sat wrapped in each other's arms, grateful beyond words that they'd found the courage to face it together instead. The cold had lifted years ago, both from the land and from Ethan Blackwood's heart. And in its place was something better than safety, deeper than comfort, more valuable than any empire he could have built alone. In its place was home, imperfect and honest and real. Built not on transactions or conditions or carefully maintained walls, but on two people who'd been brave enough to choose each other, day after day, for all the days that followed. And that, in the end, was worth more than all the gold in Montana.